Hey Drew, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
How are you?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm good.
Good.
So,
No, just
can you go ahead and share your screen? Just check if everything is working.
how are we doing?
Okay, great.
Working? Awesome.
Hi Doug.
How's it going, Atik?
Good.
Hi, Drew.
Right.
So Drew, we have until 11:30. So,
Okay.
and if you can keep some time at the end for questions and answers, that would be great.
Yes. Sounds good.
Okay, I think it's 10:30, so we'll get started. So, hello everyone, welcome to today's seminar. Before we begin, a quick reminder for our participants, please stay muted unless you are asking a question. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Drew Yarger from the University of Michigan, where he is a PhD candidate in the Department of Statistics, supervised by Professor Tylen Singh and Professor Stilian Stoev. He is interested in spatial statistics, multivariate processes, functional data analysis with applications in environmental and oceanographic studies. His work has been published in leading statistical journals such as the Annals of Applied Statistics. Today, he is going to talk about the agro data and spatiotemporal functional data. So let's give Drew our full attention. Go ahead, Drew.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. I'm really happy to be here and share some of my work today. Feel free to interrupt me with questions. But to start, I'll give an overview of the talk. So I'll first give a general research overview, introduce the data that me and my advisors have been working with, and sort of how our general statistical perspective comes in handy for this data. And then for the main section of my talk, I'll be talking about a functional mixture model for predicting biogeochemical Argo variables. I will explain more about all of this later, but I'm working with another PhD student Moritz Corte staff, as well as my advisors. And then if there's time, I'll discuss another project very briefly with another student that I've been working on, which deals with predicting Argo float locations while they are under ice. And again, I will discuss that later. So to introduce you all to the data, the Argo data is an international collaborative that started around 20 years ago. And what they do is they deploy floats in the ocean. And in this plot, or in the left-hand side picture, you get sort of the general idea of what a float does. So after it's released into the ocean, it drifts at about 1 kilometer depth in the ocean for around 10 days. And then it will descend to 2 kilometers depth and then gradually float to the ocean surface. And as it ascends to the surface, it'll collect measurements of temperature and salinity at different depths in the ocean. So once it's at the surface, it will then figure out where it is through GPS and transmit its data through satellite. And this data then becomes part of the data set that they use. So one of these cycles is called a profile, this 10-day cycle of the collection of temperature and salinity measurements. And then these measurements are indexed by pressure, and this is what oceanographers use to denote depth. So 1 decibar of pressure is about 1 meter in depth. 0 decibars here corresponds to the ocean surface, while 2,000 decibars is about 2 kilometers deep. So here I've plotted an example of about 10 profiles, data from about 10 profiles, where data from the same profile, measurements from the same profile are connected by faint lines. And these are temperature and salinity measurements from a single float. And temperature, we're probably more familiar with, how warm or cold the water is. Salinity is just a measure of how much salt is in the ocean. So how much these together tell you some about the density. So maybe a little bit of extraneous terminology, but near the surface of the ocean, there's what's called the mixed layer, where the relationship between the ocean and the atmosphere is governed. And then there's usually a quick change in ocean properties, often kind of called the thermocline, and the temperature. And then as you go deeper, things are a little bit less interesting. There's less variability in the deep layer, since the atmosphere isn't forcing these properties in the same way. So at a broader scale, the Argo data there are nearly 4,000 floats, and more than 2 million profiles have been collected in the last 20 years or so. These are locations of profiles collected in a recent 10-day period or so. So what's really nice about this data for oceanographers is that it's relatively uniform in space and time. So satellite data is one other way oceanographers use for data sources, but it only really provides information about the ocean surface. It doesn't really tell you anything about what's going on, anything deeper than that. So it's limited in that way. And then the other common data source is ship data, but this was highly biased towards the Northern Hemisphere and during summer months. So there was a lot less data in the Southern Hemisphere and during winter months. So this has greatly advanced, scientific monitoring of the oceans in the past 20 years. And it ends up being a lot of interesting data. So this is the data that we're motivated by. And to describe our general approach and what sort of perspective we try to bring is a functional data perspective. This is truly 4-dimensional data in space and time. So we have longitude, we have latitude, we have pressure, denoting depth in the ocean, and we have time. And it's hard really to try to build a model for all of these simultaneously in a comprehensive way. So what we aim to do is to treat it as 3-dimensional space-time data of functions of pressure. So this sort of matches with the data collection process. Each profile can be viewed of as functional data, and our overall goal is for each location and time to predict a entire function of pressure, like done in this plot here, so that you sort of are able to represent this dimension more easily with the functional approach, and then use sort of space-time methodology to deal with the rest of the dimensions.
I think, can I interrupt you for a minute?
Yes.
I'm a bit confused. So you said truly 4-dimensional data, longitude, latitude, pressure, and time. So there's no temp. So I kind of missed what happened to temperature, because your plot has temperature on the x-axis.
Yes. So I guess I'm thinking about the 4D dimensional in terms of the spatial domain. So we have temperature and salinity measurements.
I get it.
Yes. So ideally, we want to build models for temperature and salinity while taking into account longitude, latitude, pressure, and time all at the same time. So yes, good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So to describe more of the sort of statistical setup we might have, we'll let I index the profiles and say we have n profiles. And for each profile, we observe a single location and time, which will denote S of I. And we also observe a set of pressures and measurements, the pressures being Pij, and the measurements, say temperature for now. We'll just assume we have one variable. is xij. And then we observe this data at a variety of different pressure levels, j equals 1 to m sub I, which might vary by the profile. And the standard approach in sort of the spatial FDA literature has been to decompose your measurements as a mean function of pressure. So this will sort of denote the long-term mean. You'll add some sort of idea of what's going on in the variability, what's the spatial space-time pressure dependent structure, and often that's decomposed as a functional principal component decomposition, where these phi k's are your functional principal components, denoting the sort of directions of most variability and pressure of your data. And then these alphas, which are your principal component scores, will sort of be how you incorporate the space-time information. So these space-time scores will be modeled using standard spatial models for univariate spatial data, and then having some sort of unexplained error term. That's IID usually. So this is sort of the bread and butter model that has been used in this area. One sort of immediate criticism you might have for this model in the context of the Argo data is that it's not really complex enough. In the ocean, you might have very different regimes. You might have seasonality that you might want to take into account. So your mean functions and your principal component functions might be inappropriate for different areas of the ocean or different times of the year. So you would want to handle this sort of non-stationarity or changes as you move to different areas in the ocean. And the first sort of statistical work to tackle the Argo data comprehensively was to use a local approach in Casella and Stein. So what they do is just fix a single location at a time. You only use nearby data, estimate your model, and then use that model. And then repeat this process at a variety of different locations on a grid so that you're able to adapt this model to different areas by using this.
Joe, I have a quick question for about the model. So you have this like repeated observation at each location, and so this GA. So you have multiple observations for each location, is that right? Because it's a float. But do they follow the same path? That is, they share the same spatial location?
Yeah, so let me go back to, oh God, I did not want to annotate. Just a sec.
That's okay, that's supposed to be a brief question.
Yes, so what I'm referring to as the J is indexing the measurement in the profile. So there will be different depths and each profile, I guess it's a bit of an approximation. So they're not exactly at the same spatial location when the float rises to the surface, but really the only spatial information is just when it reaches the surface and connects to satellite. So we sort of assume that all of the pressure measurements and temperature measurements at those pressures are taken at the same location. So it's a bit of an approximation.
That's okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, so sort of my first work was to extend this local approach to functional data. What Casella and Stein did was to only consider data from one pressure level at a time, so that you simplify the data a little bit that way. And then another approach to handle these sort of changes in the structure of the model would be clustering. And that's sort of what I'll focus on today. And then just a little disclaimer about this functional data approach. This is not really the standard way to do things. What oceanographers do and the recent other paper Cassell and Stein have done is to do this one pressure at a time approach, which you can compare and contrast with the functional data approach. The advantages we think are you sort of characterize the dependence across pressure. There's dependence in the data that if you just do one pressure at a level at a time, you're not taking into account. Things like integrals and derivatives of these functions are relatively easy. And if many themes of interest are integrals, for example, ocean heat content is sort of an integral in space and time and pressure of these things. On the other hand, you sort of have to believe in this decomposition of the variability into the pressure and spatial components, which may not always hold true, but may approximately hold true. I'll just briefly pause for questions before moving on to the main part of the talk. Anything about the data or the setup? Alrighty. Coming at this Argo data, a few more aspects that we want to take into account. So there's a more recent program in subset of the Argo program, which is to collect biogeochemical information, data, things like oxygen, nitrate, pH, chlorophyll, relatively important for ocean life, and the chemistry of what's going on in the ocean. These sensors that they just put on floats are more expensive, so there's a lot less of this data. So if you look at the right, the profiles, these are profiles collected in the Southern Ocean in the year 2020. So you can see for our core Argo data, which only collects temperature and salinity, there's a lot more data. But for biogeochemical information, the data is a lot sparser. So we want to take into account, use the temperature and salinity data, which is much more abundant, to try to inform our estimates of things like oxygen. And we'll be focusing on this area of the Southern Ocean because there's a little bit more biogeochemical data, which makes modeling a little bit easier. So this was our sort of main motivation going into this project, to use the temperature and salinity data to better understand oxygen. And our second motivation, which was maybe a subsidiary motivation that came up as we were going through the data and what we wanted to model, is that in the Southern Ocean, there are very strong fronts or water mass boundaries that represent quick changes in ocean properties. I've plotted a few more commonly plotted ones here that sort of circle around Antarctica. So these are relatively well established. There was a paper in 1995 that sort of established a fair number of these. And the traditional view is that these fronts are relatively fixed over times with hard boundaries. So you'd expect there to be very different sort of ocean properties if you cross one of these boundaries. And clustering has been used to identify these fronts in oceanographic work. So this isn't really something totally new, but we want to take this into account when we're doing our modeling. Because if we don't, we'll sort of deal with, trying to deal with data from different sides of these fronts when we really shouldn't be trying to do that. So this was our big second motivation going into our work and for our methodology. And just to briefly compare it with what has been done in oceanography, there's been a really exciting increase in clustering in this area. And what they do is primarily using k-means and Gaussian mixture models on interpolated profile data. So it's not really a functional data framework. And what one maybe drawback of these things is that it ignores spatial dependence in space and time. There's no spatial information in the modeling. You're just really using the temperature, salinity, and maybe pressure information or oxygen information, and you're not using anything about space and time. So there's a fair amount of literature in clustering spatial functional data, which seems relatively niche, but there's a lot of work and people have thought about these sort of setups. So I'll point out two approaches that have proposed clustering approaches for univariate spatial functional data. And by univariate, I mean they're only considering one variable at a time, like oxygen. And then applications of these sorts of methodology has been more broad in things like pediatric health, in neuroscience, and elsewhere in the environmental sciences. So to summarize our overall approach, we want to build a statistical framework. We want to predict oxygen using available oxygen temperature and salinity data. We want to include this sort of clustering and mixture component to the model. We want to use this functional data framework that we've developed to handle data from different pressures at the same time comprehensively. And then we want to include spatiotemporal dependence in the model. So really our first research direction was to extend the previous approaches in the functional data literature to multivariate functional data. But we also ended up introducing an improved estimation strategy for the model. And I'll just begin by diving into the parts of the model and how we estimate it. Yes, I'll pause again for questions, but then dive in. All right. So what we're going to do is for each profile, Argo profile, we're going to assign it to a cluster, and we're going to denote the cluster assignment by Zi, and that's going to be a categorical variable in one of G potential groups. And first, to add some spatial dependence into the model, we're going to assume that there's spatial dependence in the cluster assignment. What's been proposed previously is what's called a Markov random field model with a Gibbs distribution for the cluster memberships. And what this does is if you denote a membership structure through the neighbors. So if we let D of Zi denote the neighbors of profile I, their memberships, what we say is that the membership of profile I is roughly proportional to how many of its neighbors are in that cluster. So this allows some of the spatial dependence to be taken into account through some of the neighbors, and really how you define the neighbors and how you estimate this parameter Xi will control this strength of dependence in the cluster membership. So if Xi is very large, there's a lot of spatial dependence, but if Xi is 0, then you sort of have marginally IID cluster memberships with no spatial dependence. And I've plotted just a simulation of an example of this sort of process where you have two groups and you're able to see some sort of spatial clustering in the assignments in different areas of this plot. So this gives us an idea of what the cluster memberships are going into observing the data. But once we observe the data, we'll want to update these and use the temperature, salinity, and oxygen data to govern the model and to characterize the clusters. So what we're going to do is assume a functional data model for each of the clusters. So for example, if we denote our predictors, which will be temperature and salinity, as their mean functions, having a separate mean function for each of them, plus their own functional principal component decomposition, plus some amount of unexplained errors, some measurement errors. And these are sort of just functions that sort of define the functional principal component decomposition. So I've written it in sort of matrix form instead of summed form here. And the alphas are once again a vector of scores. So this is what we have for the predictors. And then for the response, we're going to do something somewhat similar. We're going to have oxygen as having its own mean function of oxygen, and then have a section of variability that is explained by the predictors. So these alphas will be just the predictor scores, and this psi will explain how the predictor scores relate to the response at different depths in the ocean. And then since everything, temperature and salinity may not be informative about all parts of oxygen, we add another term that is variability not explained by the predictors, plus also some unexplained error for oxygen. So to describe this model a little bit more, the space-time dependence is modeled through Gaussian processes on each of the principal component scores of alpha and eta. So we're taking into account the spatial information there. One approximation is that independence between different components and clusters are assumed so that alpha and eta are independent, and then you can treat each of their principal components separately and independently.
Drew,
and then the unexplained error is assumed IID Gaussian. So this is the general framework for the model. Commonly, to approximate these functions, we use B-splines or basis functions that provide enough flexibility for the dimension of pressure. There's a lot of notation on this page. I guess one thing is that we can choose a different number of components for the predictors and the response. So we have K1 components for the alphas and K2 for the etas. So
Drew,
yes.
So just a quick clarification on the notation. So can you explain the variability explained by the predictors thing? Is because the predictors is Xij. I'm kind of confused here.
So, okay. We're going to take the predictors as these x's, and we'll have a mean function for those predictors. And then this second term will describe the variability in the x's. So if it's especially hot in the ocean, maybe this psi will describe the first component of the size, and the alphas will describe the variation that maybe it's hotter than usual in this area right now. So this, information about how, warm or cold the ocean is will be encoded in these alphas. Mm-hmm. And then once we have this information encoded in the alphas, we'll then use this term to tell us how much that influences the response. So these psi's, for example, the first psi function will explain how the first principal component of the predictors affects the response at different pressure in the ocean. So maybe if the temperature is a lot hotter and the first component is very different, this might affect the response in different areas of depth in the ocean. And these psi's will try to approximate that or estimate that relationship.
Should this be Xij then, or is it's Pij? Because that's where I'm getting confused.
So this approach allows sort of different dependent structures. There might be dependence between oxygen at temperature at different pressures. So you definitely think that there's dependence at a fixed pressure, that there's dependence between the oxygen and temperature, but this is also somewhat describing dependence at different pressures. So how does oxygen at one pressure, how is it affected by temperature at a different pressure? So this psi will, deal with.
It makes sense now. It makes sense.
Yes, so it's sort of like a functional linear regression model, if you're familiar with that. We're trying to assume this sort of model for each cluster. Thank you. Thank you for that question. All right. So the next question is sort of how you might estimate it. What previous approaches have done is to treat the cluster membership Z, as well as the principal component scores, the alphas and the etas, as latent variables. And this makes things challenging since we don't observe them. And sort of the traditional approach is to employ an EM algorithm. So briefly to review what this entails, we'll set initial parameters omega. And to estimate these parameters, we iterate through R equals 1 to capital R. And for the E step, we compute the conditional expectation of the complete data likelihood with respect to these latent variables, conditional on the data. So this gives us an idea of how to sort of integrate out these latent variables so that we can estimate the parameters. And in the M step, we maximize this likelihood, this Q function to get a better idea of what the parameters are. So the main challenge with this is that this distribution, the conditional distribution of alpha, eta, Z, conditional on the observed data, is non-trivial. One approach that you might try to simplify things is to break it into a marginal and conditional one. So first construct the conditional distribution of Z given X and Y. And then once you have a value of Z that you like and understand that, construct the conditional distribution of the scores given Z. And this simplifies especially this second computation. So once conditional on all your data, everything's multivariate Gaussian. And once you condition on everything, these alpha and etas are just also multivariate Gaussians. So you can get the form of them relatively easily. Just constructing this distribution of your cluster memberships is relatively hard. And to see why that is, if we let script Z be the set of all length n vectors with potential entries in 1 through G, if you want to compute this distribution, you might use Bayes' theorem to provide for a fixed membership Z, sort of have this summation term on the bottom where you're summing over all possible cluster membership combinations with in the numerator the probability of a particular cluster membership. The challenge is that the sum in the denominator is huge. It's potentially G to the N, which even for a relatively small N or G is hard to handle. And spatial independence means that the likelihood doesn't factor much. So if you assumed like an independent model, you could sort of assign cluster memberships individually and not worry about how different cluster memberships affect each other. But since we have this spatial dependence, it makes things challenging. So what previous approaches have done is an MCEM algorithm, which Monte-Carlo EM. So what one does is just tries to sample from this distribution instead of constructing it directly. What you'll do is sample it over tau for tau equals 1 to t, and then sort of use a Monte Carlo average to approximate your Q function that you then maximize in the M step. So this helps you because you're able to actually try to do things properly, but you also are burdened by computation because you have this Monte Carlo approach. You have sort of a double iterative approach where you have the EM step, and within each EM step, you want to do this Monte Carlo approach. So it makes computation a lot more challenging. And what we use to try to do target this distribution of disease is importance sampling. So what we do is momentarily ignore the spatial dependence in the X and Y when sampling this distribution, so that the cluster assignment for each profile only depends on its neighbors and the data at that location. So that makes things a little bit easier, where you have n times g times the number of neighbors that you're using sort of terms, which makes things computable. And sort of another way we motivated this, if you have a lot of data per profile. In the Argo data case we do, there are a lot of potentially 500 to 1,000 measurements per profile. So sharing information may yield little gain in sampling Z, because you already have so much data at that information, and sharing spatial dependence may not yield very great gains. And then we still are using the spatial dependence. The Markov random field is being used to sample these Z's, and then in our samples of alpha and eta in this second step here, we're still using the spatial dependence. So this is just sort of an approximation, and since we're not using the exact approach, we then can re-weight the samples using importance sampling to target the correct distribution. Samples that look a little bit more like the spatial case will be weighted more than the other ones. Other approaches have used Gibbs sampling, and we found that our approach works better, especially when you have a lot of measurements per profile. And I can discuss more about exactly why if you're interested. That's sort of our model, our approach, our estimation strategy. I'll then go into sort of the implementation and discussion about how we implemented and some of the more details of model selection, that sort of thing. Briefly pause again, but for our data analysis, we focus on the years 2014 to 2020 in the Southern Ocean, and this is about 13,000 biogeochemical profiles. There are about 10 to the 6 oxygen measurements within these profiles, and about 10 million temperature and salinity measurements each. And then what we're going to do, we're going to train the model using this data to have the oxygen sort of govern the cluster approach. And then once we have our model and we're happy with what we have, we're going to use the additional temperature and salinity Argo data that only has temperature and salinity to predict. So this is about 100,000 additional profiles with a lot more data. And we've implemented our approach in R with key steps in C++ through RCPP. So just to give sort of a better idea of what computationally is going on here, one of the main computational challenges is in the expectation step. To find the conditional distribution of the scores, we decompose a square matrix of dimension n times n, where n is the total number of measurements. This is what you would be doing if you did it naively. So since n is in the tens of millions, this is a little bit much. And trying to compose this matrix would be a challenge. A common thing to do in the functional data literature is to use some sort of Woodbury matrix identity, which would reduce to dimension nk times nk, where k is the number of principal components used. So this is helpful because this is closer in like the hundreds of thousands instead of the tens of millions. And then the independence assumption on the scores and the clusters induces some sparsity in this matrix, which is helpful. If you have more clusters, it makes your computation easier because there's more independence assumed. And then there are a number of spatial approaches to approximate things. So one example is the Vecchia approximation, which we use, which fits well with the likelihood-based approach that we're using. And what this does is sort of conditional independence is assumed between locations that are not neighbors. So there's additional sparsity assumed in this matrix, which makes things easier. And then one thing we also do is use a certain type of spline functions that other approaches have tried to avoid or thought they had to use. And this reduces sort of the memory use from NP, where NP is the number of basis functions you're using to approximate your functions, to 4n. So this is an improvement, especially in memory use, because when we have n being relatively large, this even forming the spline approximation matrices was relatively challenging in some cases. All right, so to dive into some of the results, I'll be presenting some of the results for 5 clusters. And I can discuss more about some of the details of things like model selection and prediction. But these are sort of the clusters we get in the Southern Ocean. And I plotted the fronts along with it. And we can see we sort of, in some areas, approximate the fronts pretty well. So we're taking this into account in terms of the predicted cluster membership. And we're able to predict these cluster memberships on a grid because we're taking into account the spatial dependence and using nearby profiles to, with the neighborhood structure, to define a cluster and then a predicted probability of that cluster. So we allow some uncertainty in those clusters. And these are the oxygen mean functions for each of the clusters and the mean functions, their colors match between the two photos, the two plots. So that's helpful. And you can see how oxygen changes as you move it for different areas of the ocean in the Southern Ocean. We're also able to do some prediction, taking into account the temperature and salinity information. And we're just using sort of conditional expectations, integrating out the cluster memberships. So if you, these are sort of the predictions we get at one fixed level in the ocean, about 150 meters deep. And we see we are able to sort of switch well between the different clusters. The predictions change relatively quickly as we move from one cluster to another. And then for our variability estimates, you can kind of see the amount of variability in the cluster memberships. When you're not sure about which cluster you're in, you see heightened variability, which is a good thing. So we're providing these predictions with these uncertainty estimates. So what this looks like from the functional perspective is that you have sort of these functions, predicted functions at different locations and times. So what I've done is just take a section with fixed longitude and different functions along this section right here, and shown the predictions and the variability. These are sort of our goals and how we achieve them. So to summarize what we've done, we offer some methodological contributions in terms of introducing a mixture model for multivariate, functional spatial data, all of those things hopefully at the same time, which is a challenge. And then we introduced an improved EM estimation strategy using importance sampling. And then for the application-based ones, we have a large-scale data analysis that includes some model selection, validation, and prediction. The predictions take into account uncertainty in the cluster memberships. We provide oxygen predictions for each month from June 2014 to May 2020. And we take into account and recover some of the boundaries of commonly used or commonly known oceanographic fronts. So looking at time, maybe have aim to either take questions or wrap up the last project in maybe 8 minutes or so. And then I would leave around 10 minutes for questions. Does that sound decent?
Good.
All right, yeah. So to briefly describe this other project, it's with another PhD student, and I have to give a lot of credit to him because he has really built a lot of the modeling and implementational aspects. In the Southern Ocean, there's very strong seasonal differences in ice cover. During this time of the year, there's not much ice at all. It's their summer. During their winter, there's a lot of ice cover. So this is a challenge for ocean observing systems. So of all of the areas of the ocean, we really know the least about the Southern Ocean during the winter. It's remote, cold, and dark. It's partially covered in ice. There isn't really easy ways to get satellite or ship data. So this historical imbalance has led to some bias in the estimates of the amount of carbon that the ocean absorbs, and Argo floats have played a role in evaluating these things. What Argo floats do is they are able to detect ice if the temperature is too cold, and they don't surface if ice is present. So they can't communicate through satellite. So these floats still collect data, but their location data is missing, and we only get their data once they surface in the spring and transmit all of their data at once that they took for the entire winter. An example is here. The red dots are valid GPS measurements where we knew the float was, and then the blue triangles are data when the float was under ice and didn't surface. So this float, started over here, collected a number of valid measurements for a couple months, and then lost its location for nearly 10 months when it showed up over here. And each of these dots represents a location of a profile, a lot of data that we would want to use. And what oceanographers have commonly done is to linear interpolate the paths as above. This is easy and it works decently well. But it's generally assumed that this is not the actual path that the float took. And also there's a lot of uncertainty in these measurements that as statisticians, we want to take into account. We know that there's, we don't really know where the flows went to a great degree. And we want that to be reflected in whatever subsequent task we're using the Argo data for. So what we do is to build a state space model that provides probabilistic estimates of the floats and their uncertainties. This sort of takes into account things like some idea of the float's momentum. So if they're going in the same direction, they might continue to go in that direction. And it takes into account things like ocean depth data so that the predicted paths of floats don't go through land. So this is estimated using a particle filter. This is sort of the output of what we get. From this plot on the same float that we were looking at, we see maybe a more realistic distribution of trajectories where the float went, but we're also quantifying the uncertainty. So we sort of have a Bayesian posterior distribution of float locations that you can sample from, and you can do sort of like a multiple imputation type strategy to quantify how much uncertainty is due to the locations being missing. So this is something we're really excited about, and think it can be helpful for a broad array of tasks that you might be interested for Argo data, and a way that statisticians can help scientists and practitioners to quantify this amount of certainty that's inherent in this data collection process. All right, so as promised, hopefully I'll make my proposed time, but just to summarize the work I like to do and what I really see myself doing in the future on the statistical side, I really feel well positioned to work on flexible and computationally feasible models for multivariate and functional data, especially spatial data. And then I'm also interested and have been working some with my advisors on developing theory for space-time functional data and how one deals with it from a theoretical perspective. And then in my applied and interdisciplinary work, I'm really motivated by unique applied problems like these that are constrained by the available data. In oceanography, I think I would want to continue working with oceanography, other places in environmental science where space-time functional data might be interesting, and really interested in either climate applications or broader environmental science. So thank you again, and looking forward to any questions or discussing more things about this work. And I'll leave it there.
Let's thank Drew again. Thanks, Drew. Wonderful talk. We have some time for questions from the audience. Any questions?
Maybe I can ask a question. So with the second part, I kind of missed how you modeled, what model you used to impute the trajectory. Is it kind of some sort of Markov model, or did you model it as a Gaussian process or something, the trajectory?
Yes, yeah, so it's like a Markov model. This is the backup slide for it. So the idea is if you denote, okay, sorry, the notation,
Sure.
Hopefully forget all notation from before.
But before you do that, maybe you could also ask my question. So really when it imputes the trajectory, it just looks at the value the last time you saw it and the first time you saw it after it went missing, because it is Markov. Is that correct? Or
so it uses the observed data to, so it's using these locations to, one, estimate your parameters of the model.
you need to estimate the parameters.
Yes,
Sure.
yes.
Okay.
So this data is still used to estimate the parameters. And yeah, I think it would give you something different if you only did the first and last, or did some sort of model for that.
Right, but couldn't you estimate the parameters from other trajectories, other floats? So I'm assuming you shared. So I'm just guessing. There's only so much. So there's only so accurately you could. So I mean, the parameters you could estimate are only so accurate given one trajectory. Is that correct? So
yes, yes, that's one thing we've thought about and discussed. And yeah, computationally, it might be more challenging to share information for different floats at the same time. But right now we're just doing one float at a time. So, you know, there's always like a little bit of our mind that's worried about, you know, missing at random versus not. So do floats behave differently during the winter when they're under ice versus when they actually have valid measurements, and there's not too much we can do about that to some extent. So that would maybe be a concern, and just, you know, trying to use like more data that maybe not be representative of the float in this area, because most of the floats that are in this area do have missing data. So it's hard to.
So getting back to what you were saying, your state space is now position and velocity. Like, is that the reason why your trajectory kind of doesn't take the shortest path? It kind of goes all the way out to the left. Okay.
Yes. So we've compared with simpler models where you have no velocity, where your posterior prediction, your posterior mean is just the linear interpolation path. And then, yeah, this velocity is really what helps it, you know, move, seem a little bit more likely for it to have gone.
I guess you could try to validate your fits by actually removing data where you actually know and predict how well it is. So for instance, if you look at the plot over there, there's a little elbow between 30 and 20, minus 30 and minus 20. So I'm just curious how you would impute, you know, data over there. But yeah, very, very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. We've spent a little bit of time trying to do validations, and it's really more challenging because either you're leaving out a lot of data that you already don't have a lot of data, or, you know, it's maybe not representative of, you know, what's actually going on when you're under ice.
Any other questions?
So I have a question that's really more basic oceanography. Is there an explanation for why there are these hard fronts? You know, so you have all this water sloshing around. So do they know why there are these boundaries like that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's loads of physics and, you know, a lot of basically physicists who do this sort of thing and think about these things all day. So I'm not going to pretend to know. but one of the big things is just the rotation of the Earth, especially here in the Southern Ocean, because really there's not any land impedance for currents. So these are really the strongest currents in the world. And as the Earth rotation, it sort of allows a circumpolar current that runs around, actually probably this direction, around Antarctica, a very strong current that isn't impeded by land, so it is able to actually use the rotation of the Earth to speed up and be more strong. So then, I guess the boundaries with land sort of start to define those things, because you have areas of convergence and divergence and that sort of thing. So that's not a complete answer, but that's one of the things that's going on for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Drew, I have a quick question, follow-up question on this slide. So it seems that clusters 4 and 5 are almost aligned with each other, and even in terms of their oxygen mean functions, and even in terms of the clustering, right?
Mm-hmm.
So did you check with 4 clusters instead of?
Yeah, we've tried a number of different cluster differences. So I think especially for these 2 clusters, there may be more temperature and salinity differences. So I think, I mean, it's interesting because if you continue to add more clusters, things continue to get more. The clusters still have some spatial coherence. So we were usually trying with more clusters rather than fewer. But 5, we aim to do 5 because it often matches up with the number of fronts that oceanographers commonly, or at least it's a common one. So if you use 4, it's maybe too few. Our clusters don't always exactly align with the fronts. They pick out some other things, maybe because we have temperature, salinity, and oxygen all doing things at the same time. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And another clarification. So you had this Xi parameter in the clustering distribution.
Mm-hmm.
So do you estimate it, or?
Yes. So that's part of the EM strategy, but it's really just one parameter that.
But is it identifiable in this model?
I think so.
Okay. I mean, what I'm thinking is, how does the data inform about the parameter Xi?
Yeah. So yes, in the E step, right? What you're doing is, one, getting a good idea of the clusters, since you're trying to integrate them out, and then construct distributional distribution of the scores. But basically what you'll do in the EB step is use whatever you've sampled. So you'll use your data to inform your clusters. It's your cluster for each membership, for each profile. And then, this parameter, Cassie, has some say in that a little bit, but really your data is going to overwhelm that some. So the data, once you go back to the M step and try to estimate this parameter, your data will be influenced through these sampled scores in the E step.
Okay, we have maybe time for one or a couple of other questions. Any questions from the audience? It seems we have no other questions. Then let's thank the speaker again. Thanks, Drew, for a wonderful talk. And all the best for the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me and for all your great questions. Appreciate it.
Bye. Okay, I'm going to end the meeting. Okay, bye, Drew.
See ya.
I'll see you in the assistant professor's meeting later.
All right.
Okay,
See ya.
bye.